right, so tonight I'm carrying on in the series that began last week called Caring for Your Clan. And what we did is we looked at the fact that, we talk about family every year, and we spent a whole month talking about family. And this year I decided to broaden the concept of family to be about our clan. And so it's a little bit larger perspective, and you're going to be hearing some grander things, I think, in this message. And so here's what we know from Scripture is that people were identified in Scripture by their nationality, by their tribe, by their clan, and by their family group. And that word clan appears 224 times in the Old Testament alone. And what we discovered was that the message of the Scripture is that we are really to try to increase the circle of our family and to remind ourselves that we're part of a clan. And what happened is these clans have broken down and become families, and those families have broken down even more, and they've become fragmented. Some people are estranged entirely from their family. And what would it look like if we began to increase the circle of our family? So there's this story of this couple, and they've got Aunt Virginia. She's been living with them for 10 years, and she's a bear cat. I mean, she complains about everything. She's nasty. She's ungrateful. Finally, she dies. They're at the service, and they bury her. They're driving home, and the wife turns to her husband, and she says, I know this is absolutely terrible to say, but I'm not going to miss her. And I don't think I could have lasted one more year with your Aunt Virginia. To which he said, my Aunt Virginia? I thought she was your Aunt Virginia. My mother got it. And so what we're going to be looking at today is we're going to be talking about this thing called From Cradle to Grave. And some of you remember Dennis Miller, the comedian. He said this: the left promises abortion rights and cradle to grave protection. The trick is to make it to the cradle. That is a very telling, very clever statement if you think about it. And so what I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be talking about what that really means from cradle to the grave. What does it mean to take care of people from cradle to grave? And whose job really is it? So if you look into the book of Genesis, you find out there's some stories of brothers. The book of Genesis is bookended by a story of 2 brothers at the beginning of the book and 12 brothers at the end of the book. Most of you already know where I'm going with this. So we look at the very first family in history, and I always joke about this, that the first family in history was the first dysfunctional family in history. Eve had an eating disorder. Adam didn't wear the pants in the family. In fact, he didn't wear any pants at all. Right? And then you have these 2 brothers, the first 2 brothers in history. Talk about sibling rivalry. He kills his brother. And so then God comes and finds Cain and says to him, where is your brother? And to which he says, he knows darn well where he is. He killed him and buried him. He says, I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper? And we're all familiar with that expression. Now, here's my question, because God doesn't actually answer the question. He's got more serious things to deal with. Here's the question I'm going to ask you. Is he his brother's keeper? Yes. Are we our brother's keeper? Yes. And I think the one thing that Scripture teaches again and again is that we actually are our brother's keeper. No greater love does a man have than to lay down his life for his friend, to lay down his life for his brother. It doesn't get any more serious than that. Yes, we are our brother's keeper. So keep that in all mind. So we have this other story at the end of the book of Genesis, and it's about Joseph. He had 11 brothers, and how did they treat him? Terrible. Terrible, but not as bad as Cain. They didn't kill him. They were going to. They ended up selling him off as a slave, and he ends up in Egypt. He spends some 12 or 15 years in Egypt, and during that time, he rises really to become prime minister of Egypt. It's an extraordinary story to think that this Jew could have risen up by the favor of God and become the right-hand man to none other than Pharaoh. And of course, you also remember that there was a plague in the land, or a drought in the land, and everybody was starving. But of course, Joseph had put together this plan, and they had 7 good years. Now they're in the 7 bad years. Everybody was out of food, including his family back in the homeland. And so his family travels to Egypt, and they get there, and that's where we're going to pick up the story. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, but here's where we're going to start. So Genesis 47, verse 11 and 12, it says, and Joseph situated his father and his brothers and gave them a possession of the land of Egypt, in the best of the land, in the land of Ramesses, as Pharaoh had commanded. Then Joseph provided his father, his brothers, and all his father's household with bread according to the number of their families. Take a wild stab at it. What word do you think families is? And the word is clans. And we actually, here's what's sort of fascinating about this, is that we actually know exactly how many people are in this group because it names them and numbers them in Genesis chapter 46, just the one before this. And I'll tell you how many people it was so you don't have to go bother counting. It was 70. His clan was 70 people. 70 people arrived from the homeland into Egypt, and Joseph was his brother's keeper, and the very same people that sold him off as a slave, he took care of every last one of them. Isn't this an incredible story that he had such forgiveness and such care that he was willing? And see, that's the power of family. That's the power of clan. So I'm going to give you a little history lesson. How many of you like my history lessons? How many of you could rather not be bothered with them? Maybe so. So here's my little history lesson. I want to throw that shot up of the 3 pillars of the Western civilization or Western society. And if you go study these things about Western society, it's not true of other societies because they're not shaped and formed the same way as ours is. But we have 3 fundamental pillars that hold up our society historically, and they were government, sometimes called the state, government, family, and church. And when you look at these 3, they function together. And when you look at the last 2,000 years of Western civilization, and you recognize these things have really functioned together. And what's really important for us to understand is that each one, the church, the state, and the family, have different roles. And you can see I have family in the middle of this for a very important reason, because it was the first and the foremost, and it pre-existed all these others. But the government is simply this, particularly national or federal governments. This is their job. I want you to think about this, and you could go research this on your own. But historically, their job was really 3 things: the rule of law, the monetary policy, and national defense. And when you look at provincial and civic governments, municipal governments, they actually deliver all the services. Federal governments don't do that. And that is actually beyond their scope historically. And so that was their role. And then you have the church, and the church had a very important role historically in Western civilization, and it was to provide the spiritual framework for any society. So it was we learned through the church to love man and to love our God, obviously. We learn right from wrong. We learn forgiveness, and we learn how to serve other people. And that was the contribution that church has made for the last 2,000 years. But then there's the family. And the family is actually where character and values are formed and developed. It's where we actually practice to live and to love with one another. We learn honesty, and we learn respect, and we put all of these things into practice, and we actually literally serve one another. And so there's these very distinct 3 roles for these 3 pillars. And here's what happens. When you mix up the roles, everything goes off the rails. And what has happened in our generation is it has gone off the rails. For example, and I told you last week about the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, where they have tried to eviscerate the church, and so they've been marginalized and they've become powerless, and the state has taken on the role that the church once occupied in the province of Quebec. But worse yet is what's happened to the family. And what's happened to the family is the family's role has been usurped by government. Now, some of it's our fault because we want them to take care of everything. We want them to take care of us cradle to grave. And this is sort of this struggle that we have, is that we have had and we have wanted the state to do everything for us. So what we've seen is this all-powerful government, particularly through the years that we've just had of COVID, government has become more powerful and more overreaching and has taken on greater and greater roles. And I think the church has been marginalized, and I think the authority of the family has been usurped. You can make up your own mind on that or not. So I want to give you a couple of historical examples about the state, but what I'm going to do tonight is I could talk about Canada, I could talk about the U.S., and I'm going to make somebody mad because, it would seem too partisan or too political. So I'm going to talk about Britain instead. And so in 1945, We just finished going through the Second World War, and nobody was more affected than the nation of Britain. They were in both feet in both world wars. They lost more people than Canada or the US or any of these countries. They were there from the beginning, there to the end. And specifically, who did they lose? They lost millions of fathers, sons, and husbands. The family was ripped apart. And you know, Britain, if you go look at their history, they've not always been great at taking care of people. They've always had great amounts of poverty, great amounts of ignorance and illiteracy. You've all read Oliver Twist. You know all about orphans roaming the streets like a band of, wild cats, which is absolutely true. The access to education and healthcare and all those things historically was very limited. And so the nation had got through this world war, but they were a broken country. And there was a man by the name of William Beveridge, and Beveridge had written a report. He was the director of the London School of Economics, and he had written this report, and he had suggested, here it is, or here's the short version of it, and he had proposed for the first time in Western history this comprehensive social network to take care of all their problems. So stuff like this, universal health care and social security and unemployment insurance and old age pension and all these things. And this little booklet that you're looking at right here costs about 6 cents. It sold 500,000 copies. Everybody was reading this and everybody was all over it. And it was Winston Churchill, who of course had just led them out of the World War. He was still the prime minister in 1945, the year of the election. He read the report in one of his speeches. He referred to it and he coined the term cradle to grave security. Now understand this, that he was a little bit tepid about it because he was a conservative and he thought that was far too much government interference in people's lives. Now the opposition Labour Party, they went all in on it, and this was their campaign. Check this out. You gotta love it. Demand the Beveridge Plan. And if you look at all those things, it goes right from the very top of maternity grants to the very, very end of funeral benefits. In other words, the plan was cradle to grave security. Well, guess what happened? The Labour Party in 1945 won in a landslide victory of more than 100 seats more than the Conservatives. Because who wouldn't want this? Who wouldn't want all of their needs taken care of from cradle to grave? They jumped in. The nation did. Now, there's only one little problem with this plan. Within 5 years, they could no longer afford it. And they had already slashed the benefits by 25%. And are you ready for this? The income tax rate, you know how we have marginal rates, and you have the top rate for the top income earners. You ready for this? Their top rate was 99.25%. 99.25% was the top rate. I bet none of you are paying that much. We complain about our taxes, but nobody's paying 99%. And how many of you remember, how many of you are Beatle fans? Any Beatle fans in the room? I'm a Beatle fan. Do you remember the song Taxman? Taxman, here's the poster. Taxman, it was written by George Harrison. And it was all about the tax man. And here's the line in it. It goes like this. If 5% appears too small, be thankful I don't take it all, because I'm the tax man. Yeah, I'm the tax man. Do you remember the lyrics now? And of course, it was in that melodic, happy way that the Beatles sing. But it was actually autobiographical, and George Harrison was mad. He was finally making some money, and he was paying 95% taxes. If 5% appears too small, be thankful I don't take it all, which is what they used to do. And that's why we had the British invasion of music. Some people think it was because they wanted to expose their music to Americans. No, they wanted to pay less taxes. And that's why so many of them flooded into America with their music. And so what we discovered is that it didn't really work. And what we know today, after all these years, when you look at the welfare state, wherever you work, you look at it, socialism, as wonderful as an idea as it is, and I'm not ragging against socialism, but we have not got a single example in history anywhere in the world where it's been sustainable long time or long term. You look at Albania, you look at China, you look at Russia, you look at Venezuela, you look at Cuba. There's nowhere where you could be able to point to it and say that it has worked on long term on this. And so it's a noble thought, I understand that, but if it's not working, it's not working. So I want to take another little turn on this because that was the state, and it sounds a little bit political, but let me tell you about when the church tried it, because the church tried it as well. And some of you remember it's in Acts chapter 2, and the church has just been birthed, and they're expecting Jesus to return. And this is what it says. It's Acts 22, verses 44 to 45. It says, "Now all who believed were together, and they had all things in common, and they sold their possessions and their goods, and they divided them to all as anyone had need." And you go read the whole story. They were selling their farms, they were selling their businesses, and they were bringing the money and putting it at the feet of the apostles, and they were distributing it to everybody. And you might not like this term, but I'm going to say it. It was a socialist experiment is what it was. And they thought, we could do this. Why were these guys doing it? You see, you've got to understand the context of this. Why were they willing to sell their farms and give it away? Because the return of Jesus in their minds was imminent. The return of Christ was any minute. They thought it was in days or maybe weeks, not decades or centuries. It's been 2,000 years since Jesus said, "Behold, I come quickly." That quickly thing is awfully slow in my mind, but to God, one day is as 1,000 years. So his quickly is a lot different than our quickly. So they had no idea. They thought that he was coming. What would I need a farm for? What would I need a business for? If Jesus is coming next week, yeah, I'll give it all away. Sure, get rid of it as quickly as I can. And then what happened is 2 years later, we're in Acts chapter 6, things have all changed. And you remember the people were murmuring because the distribution of food was not going smoothly anymore. The whole thing did not work. And here's why. Government, church, either one, you try to meet everybody's needs, it's not going to work. You know why? Because it's too centralized. Here's a simple question. I think you all know the answer. If you were going to deliver a service, if you were going to deliver some sort of plan or program, who would be the best equipped? The person nearest to the problem or the person furthest away from it? And the answer, of course, is nearest. For example, we need our streets cleaned of snow in the winter, right? Who would you rather have do it, the federal government or the city of Winnipeg? You want the city. Why don't you want Trudeau to clear your streets? Because he can't clear the streets of his own city, for goodness sakes. Hey, can I take a moment on that? You don't mind, do you, Saturday night crowd? That was well worth it. That was well worth it. Thank you very much. But I'm not done. Here's what he's failed to do, and you know this. I mean, we're 3 weeks into this thing, and they're still clogging the streets. They're now doing it in our city and other places and demanding these things. And here we have a leader of our country, who refuses to sit down with them. All he had to do was sit down and listen to what they had to say. But he refuses to do that. He hid for a whole week. Now he's appeared in public, and he stands at a distance, insulting them and threatening them. Like they're terrorists. They're not terrorists, they're truckers, for goodness sakes. They're dancing in the street. They're not shooting machine guns into the air like in some Arab country, right? It's so ridiculous to me that we haven't got leadership that understands empathy, and that you have to talk to people and give them a chance. And see, here's what's happened. I think it's emblematic of where our society has gone. The powers to be have become way too powerful, and they've become used to ruling over us, and we have a rebellion on our hands. And it's so Canadian. Such a friendly rebellion, right? I don't care what you think about it. I'm just saying this is bad politics and bad use of how they're doing it. So here's what I want to do in the last few minutes I have here is I want to look at Jesus' life. And I want to look at Jesus' life from cradle to grave. And the thing about Jesus' life is it was literally from cradle to grave. We have the record from cradle to grave. We all know that he was born in a feed trough, in a manger. That was his cradle. We all know that at the end of his life, he died and was buried in a tomb hewn out of the rock. We know about his cradle. We know about his grave. So I'm going to take a couple of minutes. I'm going to talk about the family life of Jesus. We rarely talk about the family life of Jesus. We talk about, his ministry, and we talk about his teaching, and we talk about the Gospels. we never think about him in the human form and in the family. And I'm going to go through, and I won't spend a lot of time in each one, but we're going to go through 4 things. We're going to talk about the cradle, the teenager, the wedding. Wasn't his, by the way. And we're going to talk about the grave. So the first thing is the cradle. So here's what happened. You all know the story. It's a Christmas story. Mary and Joseph were from Nazareth. Did they have a clan there? Yes, they did. They had a clan there. They had family there. We read about this. But because of the census, they had traveled to Bethlehem. For whatever reason, they're not with their clan. They're alone, the 2 of them. There's no room at the inn. They end up in this stable, and the baby is born in that manger. Now, when Herod the king finds out that there's a newborn king, or a supposed newborn king, he threatens or puts out an edict to murder all male children under the age of 2. And so the parents now have to flee to Egypt, which they did. And I'm wondering if you've ever thought about this for a moment. How did they pay for that? They had increased the circle of their family with some wise men from the east who brought them gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. And there was a reason for those gifts being as they were, so they would be able to support 2 years in Egypt, which is exactly what happened. And I want you to think for a moment about what Mary and Joseph had to give up. They had to give up their extended family. They had to give up their home in Nazareth, whatever that was, if they owned a house or whatever they had. Joseph, we know, was a carpenter. He would have had to have given up his actual occupation. And see, here's my point. When it comes to the cradle, when it comes to the newborn, there is great sacrifice. I don't care who you are. There is no way to bring a child into this world without great sacrifice. And the greatest sacrifice you make is in those early stages. You know why? Because, and I want to say this as delicately as I can, newborn babies are completely useless. Have you ever noticed how useless they are? I mean, we had another granddaughter, our third grandchild in August. And I always forget, every time there's a new child comes into my life, they can't do anything. Nothing. They can't eat on their own. They can't go to the bathroom. They can't even roll over. They can't even hold their head up. You have to hold their head up or it'll flop around like this. They're like that for months. They can't do anything. They're 24 hours a day. If you do it wrong, they'll die. They're so useless. And so the same week that our grandbaby was born, a doe, a female deer, in our backyard gave birth to a fawn. Let me tell you how that worked, because I got to watch it. It dropped that thing out from 3 feet on its head. It just stood there and shot that thing out the backside and landed from 3 feet up right on his head. And then you know what the mother did? You know what the doe did? It went out for lunch. It left. It just left the newborn fawn lying in the grass and went off for lunch. An hour later, came back. You know what it did when it came back an hour later? You ready for this? Got its energy up, had lunch, went out with the gals. They talked about the birth of their fawns. Oh, she's so precious. And so she comes back. You ready for this? Kicked it, and made it get up on its feet. Only been lying there for an hour. It's kicking it. And it said to it, now I speak a little deer, it said to it, get up and run away or a wolf is going to eat you. And I thought, this is how you treat a deer? You kick it and make it walk around. Meanwhile, our grandchild, an hour later, is still lying there. It can't do anything. Months later, it's still lying there. 6 months later, it rolled over and we cheered like it had cured cancer. I love kids. Here's the point I'm making on this. There's so much work. And let me ask you this. Who do you think, just take a wild stab at it, who do you think would be the best person in this whole world, or best people in the whole world, to raise a child that needy? The government or the parent? We all know the answer. It's the parent. And yet we have all of these things where we're offering parents to do this and that and this and that for them, and national daycare programs. It sounds so noble. Oh, Trudeau will take care of my child. He can't take care of himself. He's not going to take care of your child. And I'm not, I understand this. I'm saying what the government needs to be doing is empowering families to do their job, whatever that would look like. And that's a whole policy thing. I'm not going to get into it. I'm just talking about the principle here. You understand this, right? And, one of the things that we need to understand is particularly in the early ages, these kids need parents more than any other time. You know what Kipling said, Rudyard Kipling? He said, give me the first 6 years of a child and you can have the rest. What did he mean by that? He understood that the first 6 years is so formative in a child's life. They learn more in the first 6 years than the rest of their life. They learn how to walk, they learn how to talk. They can learn 3 or 4 languages if you want. How long would it take you to learn 3 or 4 languages? You won't live long enough to learn 3 or 4 languages. Yet a child can do it in the first 6 years. And their moral fiber and their character and all these things are developed. We really want to be involved in their life. So, as grandparents, Kathy and I are in that new mode, and grandparents, she's really into it, and like she was as a mom, and I, by association, am really into it. And we take our grandkids and we do something. I love my grandkids. And so we took them to hide and seek indoor park. Anybody know what that is? Just down the street here. And I'll tell you, it's a ride. I actually love going there. They had nothing like that when I was a kid. It's got these huge slides and climbing mountains and trampoline type things and things that you slide on a wrecking ball on a chain that runs down this track, and everything's padded. You can crash everywhere you want. It's so much fun. And you know what? I kind of felt at home there. And here's what I'm talking about that was the neatest part. I'll tell you why. Because when I was raising our kids, you'd go to something like that, there would never be any fathers there. It would only be the moms. And now I go there and I counted them. Half the parents there were dads. And they were a bunch of, it's worth cheering about. And they were a bunch of 30-year-old guys with tight T-shirts and gym rat biceps. I fit right in. It was fantastic, And so Kathy took the 4-year-old, and I went and took the 2-year-old, and I spent 2 hours in there with my 2-year-old. I thought, running around with a 2-year-old, it's like going out with a drunk little friend, right? They slur when they talk, they stagger when they walk, they bump into things, they fall down, you pick them up, they vomit on you and pee their pants. It's so much fun, right? Way better than going out with my drinking buddies in the old days. And all right, I got a little carried away. So the first thing here is when we look at Jesus, there was a great sacrifice, and I don't think it excludes the men. The men have to be in and involved with this. So the second moment in Jesus' life that was a big family moment was when he was a teenager, actually not quite a teenager, he was 12 years old, but that is the bar mitzvah. That's when a Jewish boy becomes a man at 12. And you remember they traveled to Jerusalem and they were doing the thing they did there. And you all know how that story ended, don't you? So they're finished their time for the festival in Jerusalem, and they're heading back. How far away from Jerusalem were they? Does anyone remember? A day's journey, a whole day's journey, and Mary noticed that Jesus wasn't with them. I don't think this was her finest moment. You can try to defend her all you want. I don't think she did that great in this moment. Imagine going a whole day, presuming that he was with the relatives, it says. So in other words, it was a clan. They thought that he was with the cousins. They turned around, they get back. How long was it before they got back? How long had Jesus been in the temple? He had been in there 3 days. 3 days in the temple. He's sitting there all relaxed, talking to the priests. And Jesus said, what are you doing? Your father's been freaking out. He says, don't you know I need to be about my Father's business? And it happens, this moment, because as teenagers, we have to let our kids go off into the world, don't they? And don't we? And they've got teachers, and they've got coaches, and they've got scout leaders, and they got band trips, and you let them out of your sight. It's sort of part of life. I don't think it was her best moment, frankly, but everybody makes mistakes. And I think the most important thing for us to remember about this story was he was a teenager, and they took him to church. I think that's what's really crucial here. Is just putting that bug into your ear They made a movie about this story. It was called Home Alone. Do you remember it? I mean, they did it. It happens. Poor Macaulay Culkin, he got stuck there with Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern. And who would have thought it would happen again, right? Home Alone 2, Lost in New York, the same two guys, Joe Pesci and Daniel Stern. Seriously? Wow. And to think it's a true story, it's so crazy. So there's the cradle, then there's the teenager, then there's the wedding. Of course, it's not Jesus' wedding. Jesus was single. You all knew that, right? And he goes to the wedding of Cana. And we know this, that it was probably a family wedding. I think it's a pretty good assumption, because who was wigging out that they ran out of wine? It was Mary. Mom was, so somehow she was involved in it. We don't know what family member. And I made a crack a few months ago, some of you remember. I said the reason they ran out of wine is because Jesus showed up with his 12 buddies and they drank it all. Remember, it says the 12 disciples were there. And I said that, went on air. I had a viewer write me, who was as mad as hops, and said, when are you going to start reading your Bible? It specifically says that the disciples were invited, which of course is true. And of course they were invited, because if it's a family wedding, you bring your friends. And these were Jesus' friends. They weren't Mary's friends. We know how he met them all. So of course they were invited to this. No, they probably didn't drink all the wine. That's not the point. The big question is this. Why, out of all the things Jesus could have done for his first miracle, why did Jesus turn water into wine? Because his mother told him so. He was 30 years old. And the point I'm making here is you never stop parenting. He's 30 years old. Mom is right involved with his life, just like she was at any other time in life. So we have the moment of the cradle. We have the moment of the teenager. We have the moment of the wedding. Of the family, whoever it was. And then, of course, we have the moment of the cross, which, of course, was leading up to the grave. And here, this is an important moment, because Jesus is hanging on the cross, and there's 4 people there. It's John chapter 19. You can go read it. There's 4 people there, and I'll tell you who they were. There was John, his disciple. There was Mary Magdalene. There was Mary, his mother. And are you ready for this? And Mary, Mary's sister. You go read it for yourself. His mother Mary's sister's name was Mary. The only good name for a woman in that day was Mary. And, they called her Mary. They ran out of good names. They called the next one Mary. 25% of all women in Jesus' day were called Mary. That's how awesome a name it was. And so anyway, he's got John, Mary, and Mary at the foot of the cross. And Jesus is hanging there, and he's dying. It's in one of his very last moments. And he looks down to his mother and says, "Woman, behold your son," and glances over at John. And then to John, he says, "Behold your mother." And the scripture says, from that moment on, Mary went to live in John's house. What did Jesus do at the grave? He considered the welfare of his mother. This is what we know historically about Jesus' mother, was by the time we get to that wedding in Cana, there is no Joseph. And none of that story, none of the narrative of Scripture includes Joseph anymore. And the scholars will tell you that at some point, somewhere between the 12-year-old and 30-year-old, somewhere in there, that Joseph had passed away. And Mary became, we never think of it in these terms, Mary became a single mother. And at some level, she had raised her son. He now is dying on the cross. And in his last moments, he makes sure his mother is taken care of. And the person he chooses is his brother from another mother, John. And remember last week I told you where he looked at the circle of the people around him and he said, "Here are my brothers and here is my mother. This is my family." He drew the circle of his family bigger, and he sends his mother off with his friend, his closest companion, John, because he knew that John would take care of his mother. And you know what the 5th commandment is? You can probably all quote it. It's honor your mother and your father. And it's the first commandment with a promise. And it says that you may live a long life in the land that I'm giving you. And here's what we don't understand about this. We always think this story is about, this commandment rather, we always think this commandment is for children to obey their mother and father. That is not written to children. That commandment, the 5th commandment, is written to adults, to honor your mother and father, or in other words, to take care of them in their old age and to make sure they're always taken care of. And when we look at our world today, it's exactly what people are not doing. They're not taking care of their parents. They don't want to take care of their parents. They want to do the empty nester thing, and they've got them off in a home somewhere, and they never see them. And I hear stories all the time about elderly people that have families somewhere that have neglected them and left them somewhere else and don't visit them and don't take care of them and don't worry about them. And they think the government should do this, and the government thinks they should do it. And I know I'm kind of pushing a few buttons here with people, but when we look at it, there's only one institution that is called to take care of people from cradle to grave, and I'll tell you who it is. It's the family. And we need to broaden our perspective on what that would mean. Of course, we look at Jesus' example, and it's the clan. The clan is to be taking care of our children, our babies, our teens, our young adults, and our seniors. And if we can get our head wrapped around that, everything changed. And I began this message with one simple thing, and I'll end with it. And the question was, are you your brother's keeper? That's the question. So I'm going to tell you one final story that I think is really cool. It's a Canadian story. So in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, there was a young man, 16 years old. His name was Thomas Stewart. And Thomas Stewart was injured. I think, from what I understand from the story, I think he got a knife in the eye or got scratched in the eye with a knife. His eye was wrecked. He was blind in that eye. They summoned the doctor. The doctor came and said, we're going to have to remove that eye. It's going to get infected. They put him under. They did the operation. They removed the eye only to discover they removed the wrong eye. This is a true story. And they took out his good eye. Then they had to go back and take out his other eye. Now this poor kid is rendered completely blind. He was very super smart, super intelligent, and he won a scholarship to go to McGill University to law school, but he can't read because he's blind. They didn't have all the technology that they have today, so his brother William agreed to go to McGill with him and to be his kind of partner in this. And his brother William read to him every one of the textbooks, every one of the papers, and every single thing he literally read it out loud. And so consequently, the two of them ended up going through law school together. And it's actually in the archives of McGill University. It's such an incredible story because this blind man from Prince Albert, Saskatchewan, finished #1 and won the gold medal in his law class when he graduated. But I find this just as cool a part of this story is his brother William won the silver medal with the second highest marks in the entire class. And you see, the question remains, are you your brother's keeper? And the answer is yes. We're all part of this thing called a clan. God has thrust us together. Pastor Steve said tonight, I loved it. He said that we are a clan together. The Saturday Night Church is a clan. We have been thrust together by God's great grace. And here's the last sentence I will say tonight is that nobody can care from cradle to grave other than the family. We're the only ones capable of doing it. Let's stand together.